the News Channel 5 network, this is Morning Line with Nick Barris.
Just in case.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morning Line. Nick Barris here on a Monday. Did you survive the rain? Boy, what a crazy weekend, but it was, lovely yesterday, wasn't it? And, we're going to continue following up on things today on all of that. But if you don't want to head out, especially stay off I-24 where there's that landslide and all this, stick around, sit down, join in the conversation this morning. We're going to be talking about something that I think affects us all, especially affects many of us in the news business when it comes to trying to report to you things that happen and getting access to information, sometimes government records, sometimes law enforcement records. And there's a movement to some degree now to limit access to many things. And I think as a private citizen, you may say, well, yeah, there should be limits. And as a journalist and a private citizen, I would agree with you. There should be, to a degree, certain limits. We've already seen it with the HIPAA laws, for instance. We can't just get access to medical records, and I think that's a good thing. Unless you have special permission from the patient or something like that, there's rules in place for that. So as a journalist, I'm not sitting here saying, hey, everything's got to be open. We should have access to your deepest, darkest secrets. It's not really about you. It's about government we're talking about. But there are some pieces of legislation right now that are looking at further restricting access, not just from the media, but anyone, to things that I think maybe, we need to look hard and fast at before we decide, yeah, let's shut that stuff down. We're going to talk about that this morning. Take your phone calls with David Plazas, who's, you're with the Tennessean, but your title, David, is Opinion and Engagement Director for USA Today Network in Tennessee.
That's correct. Thanks so much, Nick. I appreciate it. Yeah, so my responsibilities include the Tennessean, but I also oversee opinion at the Commercial Appeal in Memphis and also the News Sentinel.
Through the whole network of USA Today.
That's right, through the 6 publications we have here in Tennessee.
Well, and you're a journalist like myself, and whether it's TV news or newspaper or online or radio, it can affect us all, what we're talking about here.
The point you make is really important because I know that a lot of people are concerned about privacy, they're concerned about these issues, but remember, government works for the people. The government needs to be open and transparent to the people, and I believe there are many legislators who also believe that, who've been working for it, but we're in a situation right now where we have, in our public records law that is over 40 years old, we have about 600 exemptions. And that starts to get dangerous. Then you can start exempting different things, different pieces of information.
What do you mean exemptions to things we would have access to under the public records law?
And some exemptions may make sense. There was a panel that was put together by Lieutenant Governor McNally and then Speaker of the House, Beth Harwell, to basically look into these. And it's a continuing panel. It could take years and years to resolve all these things. But one of the things a lot of media organizations are doing are saying, take your time, look at these, what makes sense, what doesn't, and allow for sunsets. And a sunset is essentially where you say, okay, we can exempt something, but after a year, you've got to revisit it, as opposed to creating a permanent exemption that would make something secret forever.
Right. Now, if we would, just for the viewers here, and we're going to take phone calls, but let's do a little education here. I'll tell you, until I got into journalism, I didn't know, and I know the average individual, smart person who works every day, but maybe isn't in TV news or deals with this, it's not any special right we as journalists have. But talk about how, if someone out there sitting there, or if we do in a news story, or Phil Williams, who does it on a regular basis, and it's very important to his investigative work, wants to seek out a record. How do you file an open records request? What can someone do? How does that work, and who has access to that?
It should be easy for any citizen, but oftentimes it's not. There has to be a public custodian of this kind of information in local government. And there are some interesting exemptions because the state legislature itself is exempt from a lot of these open records laws. But for county and city governments, they have to have a public custodian, whether it's, let's say, the codes department or whether it's the mayor's office, who has to be willing to provide those records. And a record may not exist, so you may be requesting something that doesn't exist.
Let's do an example here. Don't speak a hypothetical. I mean, hypothetical, but I want specifics. So let's say Joe Smith is out there, and he decides, what kind of record might you think an average citizen would maybe want to get, maybe from a government that is not readily available? Give an example.
So in today's landscape of the growth, and I know you've been doing a lot of work on growth in Nashville. So let's say you want to talk about tax incentives to different companies, whether it's Amazon or someone else. If you wanted to seek out what was the proposal that the mayor's office had when it was looking to pitch itself as the headquarters #2 for Amazon. And so you would go to the mayor's office, presumably the spokesperson there or the communications director, and say, I would like this record, information on this record, or I would like emails between the mayor or this official and officials from the business. Now, some exemptions that exist on economic development, for example, allow the state of Tennessee, for example, to keep its proposal secret for several years. It doesn't mean it's right, but it means that it's meant to protect those negotiations.
Okay.
But at a certain point, a lot of members of the council, for example, have started raising this question of, well, what are we really getting out of this? And so if you're Joe Smith or Jane Smith and want to know, how am I as a taxpayer, as someone who has seen the cost of living increase, how am I supposed to know that this is a good deal for me?
Right.
I just want to understand the behind the scenes
to get that. And
right.
I know someone out there might be saying, well, I have my emails. What do I have a right to ask to see the emails between the mayor's office and some of these negotiators? There's a really good reason for it, okay? These are not their private, or shouldn't be their private emails. These are emails on business that they're doing on your dime. It's your taxpayers. Right. You're on the job. I'll tell you this, in the journalism business, a lot of times we will just put in requests for all the phone records for some public official.
Right. Or calendar requests.
Or calendar requests. And what's interesting about that is like, well, why would you want to look at someone's because they're on the clock. And there have been stories that I've done in the past where we get on there and we find a bunch of 800 porn numbers being dialed up on someone's office cell phone. Do you want to know that your dime is paying for some public official to be dialing for porn? Well, that's just an example of why it's a good idea to be able to have access, because you catch them when they're doing something they shouldn't.
So I was reviewing a lot of some of the stories from last year, and both you and I and our journalists were working on the Mayor Barry story, the former Mayor Barry story, and one of the records, for example, that we looked at is who was on her security detail, who was on her travel to different places, be it overseas to Europe or in other parts of the country, because the question was, was she accompanied, was she alone, was she with her security detail, and it turned out that, many of these cases, her head of security at the time was with her. When that might not have been the case for other mayors in the past.
Right.
And so that was important to understand what exactly was happening, how were those taxpayer funds used, and it's complicated because sometimes there are some personal issues, sometimes there are professional issues, but if you're representing the city or the county or the state on taxpayer dimes, you should know exactly what's going on.
So why is it now, I guess, if you're a lawmaker, maybe there's certain things, and a politician that you don't want to have access to because you don't want to be embarrassed if you're doing things wrong. But aside from that, I like to think most of our lawmakers mean well and are good people. Why are they pushing? And we're going to talk about some specifics here, but why do you think they're trying to place limits on these things?
I don't think it comes from a bad place. I've had numerous talks with several legislators, and I think it comes from a case of nuisance cases, those minor cases where maybe a gadfly gets overly zealous when it comes to making records requests, and so they think that perhaps the only remedy is to say, okay, we're going to do I went to Catholic school, we call it the Catholic school remedy. We're going to punish everybody for the bad actions of one person, or the bad behavior of one person, and I don't think that's right. I think there's got to be a way to keep those records open, keep the law
if someone just
applicable.
Keeps badgering, and I hear where they're coming from. Now, how about this though? Is it when you request a document or something, it may be something they can send you in an electronic file, or it's something perhaps that they'd have to make copies for you of if you wanted a paper copy. Can they charge you for that? And in which point they could make it more difficult for you by saying, well, you know what, we're going to charge you $10 a page. Are there limits on what they can charge? I mean, it should be a reasonable cost. I understand reimbursing them for the cost of the copier or their time. I don't know if it's their time also. I mean, is this their job?
Sometimes that's the case where it does come to their time, especially if you have thousands and thousands of pages of documents on a particular thing. That's why what we recommend to our journalists and also to citizens is be as specific as possible on what you want in terms of the dates that you want it. And that can be difficult because sometimes it's like a needle in a haystack. The other thing too is look on a website, because sometimes a lot of that information is already there. So for example, if you're looking for the number of short-term rental permits, that already exists. That's a record. It's not easy to find on the website.
Yeah, but you shouldn't ask them for it if you can get it yourself.
Yeah, and one thing, developing a relationship with public custodians is a good thing. A mentor of mine once said, have that cup of coffee with someone just to get to humanize that person, because sometimes they'll just be able to say, well, have you checked that link? And here's where the information is, as opposed to try to make this confrontational type of approach.
That's what I've learned, and I know that in our I-team sometimes the last option is, okay, we're going to file a public records request. A lot of times you'll put in a request and sometimes you'll be denied. And you're absolutely right. I've had some success where I've become friends with public information officers who trust that I'm going to do it and they're going to work with me. But they can also be difficult if they want, and they can just say, well, 2 weeks anyway. I have 2 weeks to process this, and we'll see how it goes.
Well, the worst case scenario, and we've been to this place before, is you file a lawsuit. And so this became evident during the Gatlinburg fire of 2016. And we saw that, we were trying to figure out, how did this happen? How was it possible that this fire wasn't contained, that it spread, it killed 14 people, did damage on thousands of homes? And we had to sue, our network sued along with other media organizations, and we got records to figure out what happened. And the idea is not necessarily to badger anybody, it's to find out the public has a right to know, why was this could this emergency have been prevented, and could this help other people from doing this again? How can we learn from these experiences?
Yeah. And that's what we're after, is trying to get information to maybe get answers, just like you said, to help. We're not just trying to be nosy for no reason. We're looking for a purpose. Look, we'll have to take a break on that note. When we come back, we can take some phone calls. Your thoughts on this and what limits there should be or shouldn't be, 737-7587. And we'll talk about some of the specific ones that they're looking at, for instance, making 911 recordings secret. And you might think, well, wait a second, yeah, that's not, well, let's just wait and get into why maybe that's not such a great idea. We'll take a break, be back with your calls and more of our conversation right after this.